So over these few weeks, what my plan has been over sort of last week, this week and next week is just to unpack a little bit of our strap line of following Jesus, loving people and bringing hope. And last week, if you were here, we looked at the story of David, who was returning the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. That's kind of a teaching point, really, about that when we face a crisis, the biblical solution is always draw near to the presence of God. When you face a crisis, draw near to the presence of God. And Jesus' central teaching in the New Testament can be summarized as the kingdom of God is near. From our Western mindset, we kind of hear the kingdom and we think of a place. But actually in the Greek and Hebrew, that word actually infers activity, the activity of kingdom. So it's the reign of God that makes the difference. So the story of the ark reminds us that God is looking for carriers of his presence, not carts. Carts are those plans and practices that seem like efficient shortcuts, but abdicate our calling to be display people of God. Jesus implied that the temple of his day had become such a cart. And by contrast, he was the carrier of God's presence. He called his followers, you and me, to likewise be living stones, carriers of God's presence that form a living temple. Following Jesus is at its core a loving people thing, and the impact of God's presence is hope. We also saw that having understood the importance of carrying the presence of God, the journey of carrying the presence was marked by sacrifice. If you remember, David was dancing before the ark in that quite famous story. You know, he's pretty much just in his loincloth and he's dancing before the ark. He's worshipping God. And every 6 steps, a bull dies and a fatted calf dies. You know, and you've got to be thinking, if you were one of the people responsible for the whole sacrifice process, you know, King David, how many steps are you going to make? Because, you know, every 6 steps I've got to try and, you know, and it's going to be complicated, isn't it? But the whole point is, it is just a massive time of sacrifice and of worship. And this was a moment of consecration and blessing, a preparation for Israel as it heals from its civil war for the purpose of it becoming the light to the nations. That was always the purpose of Israel, to become a light to the nations, to become a model of what a nation looks like with the presence of God at its center. And that was coming into fulfillment. And this was the blessing, the preparation of it. And so this morning I want to take a deeper dive into that and look into what it means to be consecrated, what does it mean to be blessed and prepared, and what do we learn from that. And bread is an interesting symbol in the scriptures. Bread is a symbol of provision. So God provides manna from heaven to sustain the Israelites in the wilderness. An extension of that thought is that the Torah, which is the law and the covenant of God, is also symbolized as bread, as it is, if you like, bread for the soul. And this is the thought that's behind what Jesus describes himself as the bread of life. And Jesus, if you remember in your New Testaments, breaks bread in 3 key different ways. So he breaks it out of compassion as he feeds the 5,000. In the upper room before his crucifixion, he breaks bread to instigate a new covenant. And he reveals his true self to the travelers at the end of their journey on the Emmaus Road by breaking bread. In each moment of compassion, instigation, or revelation, Jesus blesses the bread. He prepares it for purpose. So, blessing begins right at the very beginning of the biblical story. So in Genesis 1, verse 27, we read this. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." See, the important thing about the creation narrative is not the how everything was made, but the who. Who you are matters to God. God blesses his creation. It's a compassionate act, preparing mankind for purpose, to be fruitful and to rule. God speaks a good word over creation, and more importantly, over us. You are blessed. Right at the foundation, right at the very beginning, you are blessed. Now, what I mean by this is that whoever you are, your story has a great start. Each of us is prepared for purpose. Now, as your pastor, I'm privileged to walk through real life with many of you, and I know that not every story of life is a good one. In fact, most, if not all, stories of life have tragic chapters within them. What the Genesis account is reminding us of is that our stories begin with blessing, and sometimes we need to be reminded of this. Part of following Jesus is allowing God to retell your story from the very beginning, not from where you think it begins. I want to suggest this morning that being blessed by God has three elements to it. You are renamed, you are reclaimed, and you are re-aimed. So there's this interesting theme through the biblical narrative where God changes people's names. Abram becomes Abraham. Jacob becomes Israel. Simon becomes Peter. Saul becomes Paul. God creates moments of transformation where he invites us into an identity he defines. Let me say that again. God creates moments of transformation where he invites us into an identity he defines. I grew up with a large extended family. My mum is one of 10. And she migrated with 4 of her siblings as a child from South Africa to the UK to avoid being force moved in the 50s. So I grew up with multiple cousins. I have, on that side of the family, at least 30. I've lost count now. But it wasn't 30 that came over with the UK, so over time anyway. But there was good. We grew up with, there's about a dozen of us. And one year we all went on holiday together. Now we were all very young, and as a game, we chose characters from the Beano comic. I'm aware that this is going to culturally people are going to go, what? Okay, the Beano comic was a very old comic back in the day. I think it's probably still going. And there are characters from it. Now, I was quiet and shy in those days, and rather than choosing my own character, my cousins decided that I was Walter the Wet. Dennis the Menace's somewhat pathetic nemesis. I remember being incredibly upset, and whatever little social confidence I had drained away in a moment. I hated the name. And realizing this as small children do, the name was weaponized against me throughout the holiday. Now, growing up, I pushed the memory away, but I still remember it now and the pain it caused. It became the identity that I pushed against as I grew up. I'm not proud of the fact that in a few years later at secondary school, I would bully someone mercilessly for being such a wet wimp. In my insecurity, I saw a reflection of the label of everything I did not want to be and attacked it. Part of my journey of faith has been allowing God to redefine who I am. I hated being weak. To be honest, I'm still uncomfortable with the concept. And there have been moments where I've avoided situations where I know I will be seen as being weak. But I've come to reflect on the challenge and the truth of what Paul meant in 2 Corinthians 12. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." Perhaps that's why I can come across as a bit self-effacing sometimes, and why I struggle with arrogance. As with all of us, I'm a work in progress. As I said earlier, in choosing to follow Jesus, you are blessed. You are prepared for purpose. Within that blessing, God creates moments of transformation where he invites you into an identity that he defines, not that others have defined for you. How about you? What negative names, what negative labels have stuck with you? Will you let God rename you? However, God does more than renaming us. We all want to matter, don't we? We want to belong. We want to know where our place is and where our space is. Yes, God does rename us, but he also reclaims us. The Bible is full of stories of people who seem so far from God, and yet there is no place where God cannot find us. In saying that, what I don't want you to hear is that it could feel like threatening. There's no place I can go where God can't find me. God isn't prowling around like a lion. That's the other fella. Jesus described himself as the good shepherd who is seeking his lost sheep. So in my early 20s, I came to faith because I was questioning my value system. With the mindset of avoiding weakness, I thought personal success was the be-all and end-all of life. Who I was displayed in what I had. I had a flat, a sports car, a job that allowed me to travel the world, and a lovely girlfriend. Was the aim of life to just get an upgrade? A better flat? A better sports car? A better job? Dare I say it, a better girlfriend? These things didn't add up in my head. And in that place, God found me through a Christian friend who told me his story. In a few months of asking questions of my friend, in a church in Brixton, God reclaimed me. I think there are many people who are realizing that the promises of this world are not adding up. There is a different story being told. Your story, like mine, is one we need to share because through it, lost people are being found. Today, few people will disclose that they're thinking about faith to a stranger. Faith comes with social complexity. And so most people find faith through compassionate friends. That is why it's so important to love people, so that they can ask questions safely. Your story becomes the chief tool that God uses to reclaim those that are lost. And you get invited to share your story through loving people. That's the strength of the Town Centre Pastoral Team. Loving people, sharing their story. And don't worry about the ordinariness or the extraordinariness of your story. Think about the bread. It's the most ordinary of foods, and yet in God's hands, bread becomes something else. It becomes something that displays his compassion, his instigation of a friendship, and a way he reveals who he is. That is the purpose that you and I have been prepared for. We are re-aimed. As Jesus blesses the bread, so he blesses you and me. We are prepared for the purpose of displaying the love of God. his desire to be reconciled with us and for people to see who he truly is. As I often say, Christian hope comes from knowing who God really is, experiencing his compassion in your life, and being reconciled to him. He brings hope through you and me. Sometimes the supernatural part of our faith has this sense of an upstairs, downstairs God. We think the extraordinary elements of our faith are somehow specialized, reserved for experts. But the scripture says that the earth is the Lord and everything in it. It is actually all God's. You don't have to be spectacular to enjoy God's blessing. The most important lesson is that we're meant to be in fellowship with him and with one another. That is why we break bread together regularly. It is a reminder of the importance of that fellowship. Fellowship with God and fellowship with one another. Stephen means victorious. It's a Greek word in origin, and it's the name given to one who receives a laurel wreath for winning a sporting event or a battle. Now, I recently learned that successful candidates for elite combat forces, such as the SAS and the Navy SEALs, are not the tough, independent types, but they're the ones who focus is on serving the soldier to the left of them and to the right of them. I'm not very strong, and I don't like being weak. But most of the time, I'm weaker than I want to be. I make mistakes. I get it wrong a lot of the time. But it's okay. I've come to a peace with that. That peace has come because I'm having to remember on a daily basis that his grace is sufficient for me. My story for now is about serving you on my left and you on my right. And that, I hope, is how I'll receive my laurel crown. That's what it means to be Steve. Blessed by God, prepared for a purpose, renamed, reclaimed, and re-aimed. There are moments when it is extraordinary. But to be honest, most of the time, it's pretty ordinary. What about you? What about you? What does God want to do with you? What's the purpose he has for you?